Hello, Ben. My name is Jackson Richmond, and first of all, thank you so much for coming to GW. I really appreciate your work.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I have two quick questions. One, what do you say to those who cite free speech doesn't apply in private institutions like GW?
Mm-hmm.
And then my second question is, what advice do you have for those such as myself who is an observant Jew? I know you went to ULA, I went to IDACON in Chicago.
Okay.
How do you balance an observant Jewish lifestyle with punditocracy?
Okay, so the first question, it will be of more general interest to people. So when it comes to private institutions, obviously I'm not saying it's illegal for GW to tell people that they can't come. I'm saying it's in violation of basic standards and principles that ought to be the hallmark of any university that considers itself worthwhile. So it's a moral argument, not a legal one. I mean, they can do whatever they want. Again, they're a private institution. As far as balancing Jewish lifestyle with punditocracy, I mean, I shut down on Friday night. I start back up on Saturday night, an hour after Sabbath ends. Thank God for Shabbat. Thank God for Sabbath. Thank God for my family, because otherwise being in this line of work is not good for your sanity or mental health. And yeah, I mean, I think that being a religious person it reminds you that you have to hold fast to principle, which we all should. One of the grave problems I see in America's politics, left, right, and center, is allegiance to particular political figures or particular institutions trumping rules of basic decency, rules of basic values, and that frightens me a good deal. So I think that a religious lifestyle is conducive to reminding people that there's something bigger than just who wins the next presidential election.
Hello, I'm a senior in high school right now, and I'll be going to college next year in a typically blue state in Minnesota. And I'm typically conservative, have a conservative ideology, and I'm subject to a lot of my peers calling me racist, bigot, homophobic, transphobic, you name it.
Yep.
Every time I say something that doesn't have to do with any of this stuff.
Arachnophobic, yeah, the whole deal.
I was wondering before I go to college what tips you have for dealing with leftists and not without losing the cool.
Okay, so number one, if somebody calls you those things, you should lose your cool. It's okay to lose your cool. Like, it's one of the few areas where I think it's okay to. That doesn't mean get violent, obviously. That's the whole point of the speech. But if somebody says to you that you're a racist, the proper response is not, no, I'm not a racist. Let me explain to you all the ways in which I'm not a racist. That's an automatic you lose the argument moment. The reason being this. That person says you're a racist. You say to them, no, I'm not. But let's have a conversation. What you're really saying is you're a rational person who just called me a racist. In other words, there's a rational argument to be made that you're a racist. Let's argue about it. No, the proper response is if somebody says you're a racist, you say, calling me a racist without evidence makes you a bad person, makes you a jackass. Right? You're allowed to say that. That's okay. Because racist is not an argument. It's an emotional appeal when there's no evidence to back it. So that everybody should keep that in mind, because that one comes up all the time on college campuses and in life. If someone calls you a racist or a bigot without evidence, that makes them the bad person, not you, and you're allowed to say that back to them.
Hello, Ben. Thank you for all the work you do in taking on the safe space, trigger warning, super politically correct cancer that's wreaking havoc on colleges all over the country. And we just had a little episode of that yesterday, actually, at the school. And one of the things that I was happy about, though, in confronting this problem that we have is President Obama this past summer, he went out of his way to basically say that free speech is free speech, even if it's offensive, even if you don't like it, even if you find it repugnant, you should still tolerate it. But isn't it kind of hypocritical for him to say that, considering the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Education is really the agency that's very responsible for a lot of the anti-free speech and a lot of the anti-due process standards that they're forcing colleges to adopt?
Yes. Yes. I mean, President Obama pays lip service to free speech and diversity of thought. Unfortunately, he then backs movements that are specifically designed to shut down free speech and diversity of thought. And he does it inside the government. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Why make the statement?
Because there's still, because this is the difference between the old left and the new left, and he's trying to bridge that gap. So he's still trying to appeal to a group of people who still like to think of themselves as free speechniks, from the 1950s and 60s, without alienating all the people who are his natural base, people who are happy to shut down free speech in the name of their ideology. He's a good politician, in other words. He's also a politician who's not afraid to play footsie with really bad people. And again, that's not universal to one side of the aisle either, but it is true of President Obama for sure.
Hi, Ben. So I know you gained my respect a million times over when you stepped down from Breitbart when Michelle Fields was kind of left in the dust by them. So I'd love for you maybe to speak a little bit on that.
So, for legal reasons, which I can't really go into here, I am going to, on the advice of my attorney, I decline to comment. But all I can say is that I made many, many public statements at the time. For people who are interested, you can go to my statement BuzzFeed, you can go to my various media interviews that I did at the time to get my full and complete perspective on what happened with Michelle Fields. And I think that the tape that came out today showing Corey Lewandowski grabbing Michelle Fields by the arm and the prosecution that's coming of Corey Lewandowski is demonstrative of the fact that it was not some made-up chemtrail, Bilderberger, Jewish conspiracy to get Donald Trump by pretending that a reporter was grabbed by his campaign manager, which, by the way, would be the worst conspiracy theory of all time. I mean, honestly, if we're going to go through all that trouble at the Protocols of the Elders of Zion meeting on Tuesdays at my synagogue, we're going to do better than that.
Hi, I like to listen to you for your hardcore realism and Andrew Klavan for his bright and cheery optimism.
I appreciate it, yeah.
So my question is, as a social conservative, as part of a generation that increasingly seems to be rejecting those traditional ideas, how do you advocate for them?
So I think that the first thing to say about social conservatism, and I am a social conservative, is that there is a difference between being a social conservative who believes in social values and believing that the government ought to cram down those values. I'm a libertarian for the most part when it comes to governmental intervention, but I do believe that strong social values, social institutions, churches, synagogues, those are the ties that bind us together because, as John Adams said, in the absence of a moral and religious people, the Constitution means nothing, essentially. So, I think that that's the easiest way, and I think the truest way, to argue in favor of social conservatism is to say that it's not the government's job, for the most part, to enforce social conservatism, but reality tends to enforce social conservatism. I've made the argument very strongly today for marriage, for example. I don't think that it's the government's job to force people into marriage or even to incentivize marriage because, let's face it, the government's crappy at everything, including that. But I do think that it's an institution that needs to be promoted and promulgated. And I think that, on the other hand, the government taking sides in the social values fight and cramming it down on religious people is an absolute violation of the First Amendment and any sort of freedom principles.
And first of all, a big fan. I loved you on Pierce Morgan show.
Thanks, dude.
Over the course of my time at GW, I've been hearing this idea that, like, because you're a white male, you can't be, no one can be racist to you. And, like, although this is not, like, past my, like, mental litmus test, I can't, like, put a finger on why. Maybe if you could explain.
Because it's stupid. I mean, because that's idiotic. I mean, the idea that racism is exclusive to any one group is moronic. First of all, the definition of a white person happens to change every 20 years or so, right? I mean, if you go back to like the 1860s, there was a while there where Irish people were not considered white, and then it was Italians weren't considered white, and then it was Jewish people weren't considered white, and Germans weren't considered white, and eventually everybody is considered white altogether. I mean, it's silly to. One of the stupidities of the left is the left considers that gender, that sex, is arbitrarily defined, but race is completely solid. Right? Race is not completely solid. Race is an absolutely arbitrary characteristic, and it's arbitrarily defined because there's tremendous genetic and racial and ethnic diversity among black people, among Hispanic people, and among white people. The idea that every white person is the same as every other white person, I can tell you, I'm not the same as some hillbilly living in West Virginia. We're very different. And that's true in the black community too. I mean, the West African guy is not the same as the domestically born American black guy who lives in Chicago, and the domestically born American black guy who lives in Chicago is not the same as the other domestically born American black guy who lives in Chicago, depending on where they grew up and what they did. Colin Powell's son is not the same as another black guy who grew up 10 miles away. So I think, I actually agree with the argument that the left makes and then takes back, that race is a completely arbitrary characteristic that really should mean very little to anybody. So the idea that you can be racist but only in one direction is nonsensical to me, because I think race itself is an arbitrarily defined category.
Hi Ben, my name is Victor Burley. I'm from Summit County, Ohio, one of the few counties I think in Ohio where Donald Trump and John Kasich were split 50-50. Almost all of my family back home is very for Donald Trump. I know one of the key some of the key themes of this whole speech was decency and freedom of speech. Donald Trump wants to strengthen libel and slander laws to get rid of freedom of speech. He's just not, I don't think, a decent person. How do I talk to my family, get them to support, their own governor, get them to support Ted Cruz?
First of all, I mean, I totally agree with you, and probably about, let's see, what time is it? About an hour and a half ago, I said the exact same thing on NBC with Lester Holt. Although I don't know if they quoted me directly. If they cut that part of the tape, I'll have to check later. I believe the phrase that I used was a steaming pile of garbage, a large piling of human debris. Was I think the exact phrase that I used about Trump. I think that Trump is a disaster area, and the reason I think that Trump is a disaster area is because he's not conservative in any way. He shifts his positions every 5 seconds. This is politically why he's a disaster area. And they'll make the argument for why he's a bad person in just a second. So the argument for why he's a political disaster area is because he shifts his positions every 5 seconds based on whatever the polls tell him, or based on whatever he thinks the polls ought to tell him, because he doesn't even know what the polls tell him. He says the polls show him beating Hillary. Out of the last 50 polls, 50 polls, he has won precisely 5, and he has tied 2. So the idea that he is beating Hillary is ridiculous. Donald Trump's relationship to reality is non-existent. He lives on a planet of his own making, where that hair is awesome. And and where stubby fingers mean nothing in life. And so Donald Trump, his policies, I think, are disastrous. The only areas that I think are making him popular right now is that he's anti-free trade, which is an economically illiterate position, and that he is supposedly very hard on illegal immigration, which I don't believe for 5 seconds, because 10 seconds ago, he was not hard on illegal immigration, and if he finds it politically convenient for him to dump out on that, then he'll dump out on that too. So that's where he is politically. If you're interested in watching my full 6-minute rundown of why I think that Donald Trump is a liar on policy, it's got like 2 million views on Facebook, and you can go check it out. It's one of the, actually Facebook, I think, ranked it, up till the last 5 weeks, it was the single most effective political ad in Facebook history, actually. So you can check it out. As far as why he's a bad person, if I have to explain this one to people, Donald Trump is a bad person because Donald Trump believes in himself primarily. He's a narcissist. He's an egocentrist who believes that his personal power and maximization thereof justifies lying about people, smearing people, destroying people. He's somebody who doesn't believe in fundamental principles of free speech or decency. I mean, beyond the basic moral issues that I have with a guy who brags openly about cheating with married women, a guy who talks about treating women, pardon the language, but this is a direct quote from Donald Trump, according to New York Magazine in 1987, treat women like shit. Anybody who says that kind of stuff is on my shit list. And so I don't think he's a palatable, decent person.
Hi Ben, thanks for being here. I'm a conservative. I'm also a strong supporter of gay rights, but I've noticed kind of an odd trend here on campus, which is there's a lot of people in the LGBT community and a lot of people, and I guess you could say the activist class on campus, that are huge supporters of the LGBT community, but they're also vehemently anti-Israel, which is obviously very odd because it's a bastion for sanity and acceptance not only in the world, but in the Middle East, an area where people like that are, hanged. Right. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to that, why you think that is, and why that disparity exists.
Sure. So I mean, I referenced it a little bit in the speech, but I think that for the left, as I said, equality of outcome is the only thing that matters. The problem is that people who act responsibly in life, and this is true for internationally as well as domestically, people who act decently and responsibly tend to do better in life. So in the Middle East, Israel tends to do better than its opponents because Israel actually acts like a responsible democracy ought to act. It actually has human rights, it actually has freedom, it defends its citizens, and they're rich. So the left looks at, including a lot of gay folks who are on the left, and leftism comes apparently before the gay identity group politics. The idea is that because Israel is rich and its opponents are poor, its opponents must be victims and Israel must be the victimizer. And the tacit deal is all of us victims will get together and we will oppose all of the victimizers, of which the Jews are one, because the Jews are rich in Israel, and so Israel must be a bad guy. So if you're, honestly, again, allegiance to a political ideology before basic human decency is puzzling to me. But I think that there are people in the LGBT community who do that because they would rather have as allies all of these other victim groups than they would actually side against the actual aggressors in the Middle East and the bad guys over there. In other words, the Marxist view of history and of fairness trumps the belief in human liberty.
Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for coming here and spending your time with us. I'm glad that you brought up Herbert Marcuse. I think there's not a lot of people who've actually read him, and if you do actually read him, it's very interesting. It's very alluring in many ways. So you
Right,
actually
it's free sex for everybody. I mean, it sounds awesome.
Hey, so
I'm married. I don't have to worry about it.
it's great. You were able to tie in your discussion tonight on microaggressions a lot into the ideas of human decency and respect. So on that note, could you talk a little bit about how one can, when we're debating other people, defend a moral and probably a respectful life in lieu of all these other alluring kind of philosophies and philosophers people can invoke?
Well, I mean, I think that most people like to think of themselves as moral individuals. Most people like to feel like they're good people. At the end of the day, maybe people make excuses for why their own self-interest is decent and moral, but most people tend to be a little bit skeptical of that position. They like to think of themselves, I'm a nice, good person. And so if you can take that assurance away from them by pointing out that their political positions make them indecent and actually vile, depending on what their political positions are, then you can get them out of that comfortable character-safe space. Because usually the way an argument with the leftist goes is, I'm arguing about tax policy, and you hit me with, you hate poor people, right? And so you make a political argument, they make a character argument. It's their favorite thing to do, is what Marcuse would have done. And the idea is you have to come back at them with, no, you're nasty and a bad person, because you want to make character arguments instead of political arguments. And the same thing is true for Marcuse. Look, are you going to be able to convince people to give up all the things that make them feel physical pleasure? I mean, there's a reason that Marcuse's brand of leftism was so alluring to people. Again, it turns out people like free sex. It turns out that that's just something people are into. So when you say to them, sex without responsibility, then, and if you can grant them a feeling of moral righteousness while doing that, boy, that's an intoxicating brew. But the only way to argue against that is basically to say, you following your penis does not make you a better person, which seems to me a pretty simple rule for life, right? So and anybody who believes that is either self-serving or stupid. Anybody who believes that following your genitals make you a better person, as opposed to helping other people, doing things that benefit others, doing things that builds a better lifestyle for you, that's narcissism is not a value. It's an anti-value.
Hey Ben, I just want to say thank you so much for coming out today. As a conservative, I completely agree with your view of microaggressions. However, I have to ask, a lot of LGBT people in the community will say, referring to a transgender female as a male is not not decent.
Not decent, right.
Right. And so, how is there a line, do you think, between these microaggressions and maybe just or being rude or being respected, but does that line, is there a line, and if so, where is it?
The line is truth. Meaning that if you're saying something true, and you're not being overtly rude just for the sake of being rude, if you're saying, a truth because that's the truth doesn't mean, as one of my mentors, Anna Breitbart, used to say, the truth doesn't mean it's just the truth. So, I'm not going to shy away from the truth as I see it. And does that mean that we should bully transgender people? God forbid. I mean, one of the whole reasons why I'm somewhat passionate on this topic is really twofold. Number one, I think that there are valuable distinctions between men and women that can't be ripped away with a shot or with a surgery. And number two, I think that it's deeply, it does a horrible disservice to transgender people or any people who are mentally ill. And I'm sorry, but if you have a 40%, if you have a 40% suicide rate in your community, that is comorbidity with depression and obvious symptomology of mental illness, obviously. And when transgender surgery does nothing to cure that, the suicide rate before and after transgender surgery is exactly the same, the cruelest thing that we can do is say, no, we're going to pretend along with you that this fixed your problem, when it absolutely did not fix your problem, and we're not going to look for any further solutions. I take mental illness deeply seriously. My grandfather was institutionalized because he had schizophrenia back in the 1960s. And when my grandfather it would have been a deep disservice, a grave disservice to my father and his siblings and my grandmother and him if when he was institutionalized, instead of doing that, we had said, Nate, you know what, you're right, the radio is in fact talking to you. Right? That would have been a deep disservice. They put him in a mental institution, he took lithium, and then he was better. Well, the way we treat the mentally ill in this country is horrendous. And engaging in their delusion along with them does them no service. It does them a tremendous disservice. It's harmful to them. It's harmful to kids who are confused. It's harmful to society to pretend that gender is completely malleable.
Hi Ben, thank you for coming. I've been watching you for a few years, so it's nice to speak. My question is, if it is Hillary versus Trump, what do you think will happen, and what is the future of the Republican Party, win or lose?
Okay, so I think the Republican Party has some serious problems, win or lose, because there are obvious divisions within the Republican Party that we're having trouble bridging. Because the Republican Party says that it stands for something, never stands for it. So people are disillusioned and they're angry, and I get that. The problem is they're angry and they're just lashing out with Trumpism, which is not even a political brand, it's just a guy. All Trump is, in the words of Kevin Williamson in National Review, is he's a giant pulsating middle finger. That's all Trump is. So I don't think that goes away with Trump. Even if Trump loses the nomination, I don't think that goes away. If it is Hillary versus Trump, I think she kicks his ass. I think she destroys him. And the reason I think that is because he has alienated every subgroup in the United States. And when I say subgroup, I mean the majority of voters, including women, right? I mean, the fact is that women, you want to talk about a disproportionate share of the electorate. Women in the last election cycle were 54 or 55% of the electorate. Donald Trump is going to lose 70% of women, right? And there's a reason he's going to lose 70% of women, is because he's terrible about women. And he deserves to lose 70% of women. So I think that all of the talk about him sweeping through Ohio and Pennsylvania and winning Michigan, okay, the last poll in Michigan had him down, I think, 11 points to Hillary Clinton. He's not going to win New York. He was down 19 in the last poll to Hillary Clinton. I did a whole rundown of the polls this morning on my podcast at Daily Wire. I've said I am a never Trump guy. When I say I'm a never Trump guy, I mean I will not vote for him in a primary. I will not vote for him in a general. And the reason I won't vote for him, even against someone who I think may in fact be the spawn of Satan in Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's a rare election when you actually have to vote between the spawn of Satan and the actual Antichrist. So I'm taking the Bartleby the Scrivener attitude, which is no, I'm just not involving myself because what I said in a previous speech, somebody asked me about this at Mizzou 6 months ago probably, and I said that I would vote for a flaming bag of dog feces over Hillary Clinton. That was until they told me that I actually had to smear my face with the dog feces. And getting in bed with Trump is doing that. Getting in bed, Trump is going to smear conservatism for a full generation. Trump is all the things I fight against. I've spent my entire career fighting for, and most of my life now, fighting for a brand of conservatism that is not vulgar, that is not vile, that doesn't insult women, that isn't designed to alienate minorities for no reason, that isn't condescending toward free speech, that isn't fascistic. And along comes this guy, and I'm supposed to sacrifice all of what conservatism is on the altar of Donald Trump. When he's going, by the way, and he's going to lose 45 states. I won't participate. Is the answer. And I think, by the way, a lot of people won't. Look at the polls. 30% of Republicans say they won't show up to vote for this guy. It's not just the Trumpkin. The Trumpkins say we won't show up to vote if it's anybody else who's the nominee. Well, two can play at that game. If the logic is that you guys didn't show up in 2012, so now we're going to hand you the keys to the car, then I won't show up this time. You hand me the keys to the car next time. We'll do it that way.
You're probably going to have the most fun with me tonight. I'm a Southern liberal, or moderate liberal.
Okay.
So
thank you for coming.
Yeah, I like broadening my views. I came here, and obviously there's not a lot of Southerners at GW, so I'm in the minority there. But I'm currently reading a book called Between the World and Me.
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi Coates, yeah.
And I've read The Case for Reparations,
and
just took a class. A great professor, Professor Marcus, at our school, basically teaches a writing course for freshmen. And it really just goes into the stats. So, it's, like you said, factual basis. And he talks a lot about institutional racism.
Right.
For example, redlining being a huge factor for why blacks are struggling now. And you mentioned stats of black-on-black crime and issues like that.
Single motherhood, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I was wondering what you thought of institutional racism before the 50s and 60s and redlining themselves, and what you thought of the Nixon aid. I didn't read much into it yet, but the Nixon aid that said that they targeted African Americans. Just all of that.
Okay, so as far as number one, if you're going to read a book on slavery reparations that gives kind of a fuller view, there's a book in which Professor, I think it was Randall Kennedy, is a contributor to it. And I actually took a race class at Harvard Law, and Randall Kennedy, who's a black professor there, was the teacher, and we talked at length about slavery reparations. So I'm just suggesting that you read a wide variety of views about slavery reparations. I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates is a talented writer and an incredibly confused thinker. All I will say about Ta-Nehisi Coates is I have no respect for a man who says that he watched the planes hit the towers on 9/11 and sat on the roof of his apartment building smoking pot and felt nothing. If that's your view of the United States, honestly, get the hell out. But that's not his argument. That's just him as a person. So his argument, and which seems to be that America is irredeemably racist. There's nothing America can do that can ever fix any of that racism. He's obviously a big advocate of slavery reparations. If you want to talk about Jim Crow was evil. It was also, I should note, a creation of Southern Democrats in government. So it's a governmental policy. And a governmental policy that I would very much oppose, obviously. When it comes to redlining, the emphasis on redlining in the 1990s was skewed and inappropriate. The reason for that is because the real reason why not enough minorities were getting home loans is because not enough minorities met the actual requirements for getting home loans. And the government response to that was exactly what Bill Clinton did in the late 1990s, which is he started using Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in order to push forward what we like to call subprime loans to minority borrowers to ensure that all these people could get into houses. So good intentions paving the road to hell, which is very often what happens. It turns out that if people have bad borrowing histories and they don't have enough assets on the books, very often they're going to default on their mortgages, and that's how you end up with a subprime crisis. So if you can show me a situation in which, again, anytime you show me evidence of race, Jim Crow is institutional racism, of course, right? There's no question that institutional racism existed, for example, with the GI Bill in the aftermath of World War II that benefited white people but not black people, right? Of course that's racism. I'm not going to pretend that racism has never existed and will never exist, or that it doesn't exist among individuals today. Clearly it does. I see it in my Twitter timeline, right? I mean, but I am going to say that as a broad excuse for underperformance of groups in the United States today, 50 years after the end of Jim Crow, I don't buy it. And the reason I don't buy it is, I'll give you an example. Single motherhood is a great example because, again, I like statistics. When in 1960, when racism was rampant, right? In 1960, racism was rampant. Jim Crow was still in place. It was before the Civil Rights Act. First of all, the middle class grew faster in the black community in the 1950s than at any point since, right? While Jim Crow was still in place. In 1960, the black single motherhood rate was 20%. Today, the black single motherhood rate is in excess of 70%. 70%. Is that due to an increase in racism in American society over the same period? Or is it due to the fact that government dependency has made it easier for people to make irresponsible decisions and ruin their lives? So, before we start blaming institutional racism and the legacy of slavery and all this, why don't we think about the fact that you are born an individual into the society in which you are born into. People who are born today are not born into an institutionally racist society. I can't say the same about people born in 1930 or 1950, but I can certainly say the same about people who were born when I was born, 1984, and people who are younger than me. I don't buy the argument that institutional racism is what's causing people today to underachieve.
Thank you for being here. I'm glad we didn't have to listen to you over a fire alarm.
Me too, actually, isn't it?
So in the wake of the Brussels attacks, Ted Cruz made a comment in an interview that he would be in favor of policing or patrolling Muslim neighborhoods.
Muslim communities, yeah.
Right. The whole concept kind of made me uncomfortable until I heard you say he's absolutely right, and then kind of go on to very effectively make your point. Mm-hmm. In a country where there are so many issues associated with things like stop and frisk, and this seems to fall in that same category, how do we effectively make this point when it makes so many people really uncomfortable?
I mean, again, making people uncomfortable is just a byproduct of truth sometimes. But as far as the argument with regard to Cruz, I'll restate it for people who haven't heard it. There's a scarcity of law enforcement resources. Anybody pretending that the government is all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful, has enough resources to police everybody equally, has never been through checking at the TSA. Right? I mean, TSA is a ridiculous institution that accomplishes virtually nothing. So except hiring lots of government bureaucrats. The idea is that when you have a scarcity of resources, you have to deploy them where they're most effectively utilized. If your goal is to stop major terrorist attacks in the United States, and you're looking at the communities from which these terrorist attacks tend to occur in the West, and by the way, across the rest of the world, you have to look at Muslim communities. That doesn't mean that all Muslims are terrorists, because that's not true. It doesn't mean the vast majority of Muslims are terrorists, because that's not true. It does mean that if you have a description of the suspect, and the description of the suspect literally 100% of the time when it comes to, for example, suicide bombings, is Muslim, you're wasting your time if you're checking out the Presbyterian church with the Swedish ladies. So the idea is that this is not a methodology of discrimination. It's not going after Muslims just for the sake of going after Muslims. And by the way, I mean, it's always weird to me that people are saying, oh, well, I'm so uncomfortable with law enforcement in my community. I go to a synagogue where we have off-duty cops that are pretty much 24/7 to protect us. I feel safer when the cops are there. I think most law-abiding people actually feel safer when there are more cops around, except that we feel like the reason the cops are around is because there's more crime in our area, so that's why there's the sudden uptick in presence of cops. But the reality is that not all groups are equally likely to commit the same proportion of crimes. That's particularly true for ideological groups. The fact is not all ideologies are equally likely to produce terrorism, because that's silliness. I mean, the Taoists are not the real problem in the world right now. So that being the case, I guess the left expects us all to frontally lobotomize ourselves and pretend that risk assessment doesn't exist, which is a basic function of human activity that allows us to live our everyday life. It's why you don't run across the street when the light is red. But when it comes to how we allocate law enforcement resources, I care significantly less about hurting feelings than saving lives. And I hope that the law enforcement community is allowed enough of a free hand to do the sorts of non-invasive techniques that they were using, by the way, in New York City before the advent of, as I say, communist moron de Blasio. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.